So now we're in room 220, which is the corner room across from the stock room. And this is where we have our cryostat. The cryostat is also made by Shandon, just like the staining racks. So, hey, this is for making microscope slides. Now, we don't make the glass of the microscope slide. We can buy those in packages. So here's the microscope slides that we use for immunohistochemistry. These are specially charged with positive charges on them. That's why they say plus at this end, so that tissue sections will stick to them better. In my demo slides that I'm doing for you guys today, I actually didn't use these expensive slides. I used some cheapos, okay? But we would definitely use these if you guys were doing the experiment and try to get the best results that we possibly could. So these are our expensive slides. Here's a box of our cheapo slides. They're just plain pieces of glass. But remember, tissue sticks to glass. So all we have to do is dry it, and we will make sure that it is stuck there. So we'll be putting them in the hybridization oven, which you'll see in the next video, and that will make them dry out and really stick to the glass of the slide. So let's talk about the machine. This is called a cryostat. The particular model is Cryotone, special motorized electronic. Okay, we bought this from a company called GMI that refurbishes equipment like this. These things can last for 100 years and still do their job. And this technique of making microscope slides, making tissue sections to put on microscope slides, has been used for that long. The clever thing about this setup is that inside is a refrigerator. So this glass door is actually warmed. It's quite warm to the touch. I'm going to open it up, and inside, it's super freezing. Okay, this is right now at minus 21 degrees Celsius. So that is, you're pulling ice cubes directly out of the freezer at home, in your kitchen. That's how cold this is. This does make ice, okay? That's how cold it is in here. And what we're going to do is we're going to put our tissue in here and freeze it. The tissue then will be cut by a very sharp razor blade. This razor blade is so sharp on the top side that if I were to just touch it to show you which side is the sharp side, it would cut me and I would bleed. I have to make sure that I'm touching it only from the back side and either side in order to make sure that I don't cut myself. But luckily we have a first aid kit right here for all the students who accidentally cut themselves using the cryostat. This blade goes into this blade holder. If you can look inside. Oh, let me turn the light on. That will help us. I'm going to move this roll guard out of the way, and this is our blade holder. In order to get the blade in, I simply slide it through from the side, and then I can tighten down the mechanisms that hold the blade in place. So I can move this side to side, I can move it out or back. There's my blade. And now I want to lock it in place. This tiny little lever, I push it to the side. There we go. And now this metal plate is holding the blade in place. I'm going to use what's called a chuck. A chuck has little grooves in it, and I'm going to use a solution that will help me freeze the tissue to this chuck. And then I will put the chuck right in here and lock it into place. Then I will use this crank over here. The crank moves the chuck back and forth so the frozen block of ice rubs up against the knife and cuts small pieces of tissue section onto here. I then grab my slide and pick up the piece of tissue from the frozen plate. And because this is room temperature or warmer, if I set it on the glass and I'm holding it, it's out here. When I touch it, the tissue actually melts because the tissue was frozen, but it's super thin. How thin are we going to cut our tissue sections? We're going to cut them 20 microns thick. So our micron selector here allows us to determine how thick do we want our tissue sections to be. So every time I turn the crank, the chuck holder moves forward 20 microns. How many times would I have to turn it to move a whole millimeter? 50 times to move 1 millimeter. 50 cranks. So we could get 50, if we have 1 millimeter of tissue, which trust me, we do, I could get 50 sections onto the microscope slide. Depending on other types of tissue, you might do 20 or 10 or 5 or 15. Sometimes people even go as thick as 30. The problem is that antibodies usually only penetrate between 10 and 20 microns thick into the tissue. Even though we've treated it, we treat the tissue with Tween 20 or Triton X, which are a detergent to poke holes in it, still the antibody has a hard time penetrating deeply. So we're going to use this setup to cut small pieces of tissue from our axolotl onto a microscope slide. I've got out a large petri dish lid, which I will use as a dissecting tray, and I've got these brand new razor blades. These razor blades come wrapped in, paper so that they are not exposed, but they have double folds of metal on the backside, and they are not that sharp. I am not cutting myself, and I'm touching the sharp end, okay? So this is a razor blade of maybe about of the sharpness that you would use for shaving or something like that. And so humans are using this on the body all the time. This is not for cutting things 20 microns thick. This is for us to cut our tissue into the size that we want to use for the cryostat. So here's our 30% sucrose with our tissue in it, and here's our pieces of tissue that I showed you last week. Here is our regenerating limb with its blastema. Here's our regenerating tail with its blastema. And I really don't want the limb and the tail to be stuck to each other. Here's our original tail, in other words, the stump tail, and here's our original limb, in other words, the stump. This is the non-regenerate, this is the regenerate. This is the non-regenerating tail, this is the regenerating tail. For right now, for demonstration purposes, I'm going to put the tails back in the sucrose. And we're going to cut just a little piece of the stump of the wrist off of our donated limb. Perhaps if I put it here, that's a lot easier to see, right? Okay, so I'm going to hold this in place, and I'm going to try to get a piece of wrist that is about as big it's probably about twice as big, but I'm still satisfied because these two pieces, now I might be able to easily tell which is which because I know that my stump piece is much bigger than my regenerate piece. So in case we want to do other experiments on genes expressed in the digits, I will save this fixed tissue. So thank you again, Mijo, for the donations of your tissue to our research knowledge. And we can save these in the fridge almost indefinitely since they've been fixed. These two small pieces of tissue we now need to put in what is called a cryomold. Cryomold. A mold means a shape that we can make something out of. So here's the shape of the cryomold. I want to put those two pieces in the little space of our cryomold. But I need to freeze them so that I can then slice it. So we've got a little refrigerator right here with a liquid, open a new bottle here. Perfect. A liquid called OCT compound. OCT stands for optimal cutting temperature. This stuff freezes at the exact same consistency as cells with sucrose. So these two things are going to freeze together and make us a beautiful mold. Please always be careful to recap this, because if it dries out, it won't be liquid anymore. It'll turn solid. So we always keep it in the refrigerator so it's ready to use, and we keep it tightly capped. I'll put the regenerating limb on the right side and my stump limb on the left side. I'll press them down using the forceps so that I make sure they are completely embedded. It's also nice to get them towards the bottom, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip this upside down in order to put it on the chuck. And when I flip it upside down, I don't want to have to cut 1 millimeter, 2 millimeter, 50 times around just to get to the tissue. So if the tissue is all the way at the bottom right now, when I flip it over, the tissue will be all the way at the top, and I can immediately start saving pieces of tissue onto my microscope slide. So a common thing to do with our mold here is to label it so that we know what's what. So I'll put regenerate on this side, and I'll put stump on this side. We're only going to use this for a few minutes, so the fact that you can't read my writing really doesn't matter. What do I need next? I need a cold chuck in order to freeze this on there. But I've got a knife in the way. So before I ever reach in there, I don't want to be pulling something out and brush my hands against the knife. So never reach your hands in here to adjust anything while the blade is still in place. So I'm going to release the tightness of the blade. I'm going to push it away from me so I can pick it up from the back and the side. I'm going to place it frozen back here on this little ledge so it's completely out of the way. I cannot cut myself. And now I need to turn this into an ice cube. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to place it on this little white spot right here. That white spot is at minus 20 degrees Celsius like the rest. But notice we have a cryo boost bar. I'm going to hit cryo boost bar. Oh, do you hear the compressor kick in? Hopefully that doesn't get edited out in post-processing. Anyways, that is a super refrigerator that is called a Peltier Cooler. P-E-L-T-I-E-R. So French, I don't know if I'm really saying it right. Peltier, okay? The Peltier Cooler sucks heat out of things, and this bar will get down to minus 55 degrees within 10 minutes. So the whole thing is going to stay minus 20, which is cold. My fingers are getting cold by me touching this, but I don't ever want to touch that bar. That thing is so cold, I would leave tissue behind. But what we're going to do is we can take this metal rod and place it on the top. And now I've got cold on the top, cold on the bottom, super cold Peltier Cooler sucking all the heat out of this. What's going to happen is that whole block is going to turn to ice. Let me just get it out real quick. Can you see how it's white already? Sorry, moving it too fast. It's already frozen on the bottom, but you can still see where our tissue is. So I'm going to put it back on the Peltier Cooler, suck heat out of the top, super suck heat out of the bottom, minus 55 degrees Celsius, Fahrenheit, Peltier Cooler. The blade's out of the way, so I'm not worried about that. So while I'm waiting for this to solidify, I'm going to get our chuck ready for the next step. So this is super cold. It's been sitting in minus 20, actually for 2 weeks, while I've been getting ready for this experiment. So what I'm going to do is real quick, I'll set this over here, and let's get some OCT on it as well. Notice how the OCT immediately started turning white when it hit the metal parts of it. That's because this thing is so cold. I'm going to place this very carefully. Hopefully I won't tilt it side to side because I don't want the OCT to run off. Place that on the Peltier Cooler as well. So now what I'm going to have is a frozen block of tissue. Can you get a close-up of that? Can you see that it is, you basically can't even see the tissues embedded in there anymore because it is almost completely frozen all the way through. And our chuck now has a layer of OCT on it. The blade that we're using is so sharp that it will cut through OCT like nothing, but I don't want to dull my special razor blade by hitting the chuck itself. The chuck is made of strong metal. So I want to lift my tissue section off of the chuck so that my block of tissue will, so if this were my chuck, and this is the OCT I just laid on it, and this is my block of tissue that I want to cut onto the microscope slide, I can place this here, and then as I cut through my tissue section, I never am in danger of hitting the chuck. So I'm going to make a sandwich of OCT. This is solidifying, this is solidifying, and we'll let them cool for probably 5 more minutes, and then we'll go to the next step.